Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I call to order the 7th meeting of the 33rd session of the Human Rights Council. We shall now continue the general debate on the oral update by the High Commissioner. I would now like to give the floor to Rado. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, Rado shares the High Commissioner's concern at the increasing lack of engagement by member states with the human rights mechanisms, such as that displayed by Burundi during the last session of the Committee Against Torture in July. This worrisome trend weakens the capacity of the OHCHR and the international community to make a difference on the ground. Rado supports the work carried out by the High Commissioner since taking up his mandate 2 years ago. He displays his best efforts to preserve the independence and impartiality of the Secretariat, despite the pressure and attempts of weakening, politicization, and polarization orchestrated by some member states. Rado would like to draw attention to the fact that the creation of the Council is the fruit of a collective action, the entirety of member states, and nothing should justify the lack of cooperation with the body that we have all politically accepted. Indeed, some common challenges that bring us all before the Council, the promotion and protection of human rights.
One moment, please.
All right, could you please start from the beginning? Thank you.
Thank you. Rado shares the High Commissioner's concern at the increasing lack of engagement by member states with the human rights mechanisms, such as that displayed by Burundi during the last session of the Committee Against Torture in July. This worrisome trend weakens the capacity of the OHCHR and the international community to make a difference on the ground. Rado supports the work carried out by the High Commissioner since taking up his mandate 2 years ago. He deploys his best efforts to preserve the independence and impartiality of the Secretariat, despite the pressure and attempts of weakening, politicization, and polarization orchestrated by some member states. Rado would like to draw attention to the fact that the creation of the Council is the fruit of collective action, the entirety of member states, and nothing should justify the lack of cooperation with the body that we have all politically accepted. Indeed, the common challenge that brings us all before the Council, the promotion and protection of human rights, can only be overcome by the sustained engagement of all members represented by this august body. It is evident that poor governance, corruption, enforced disappearances, discrimination, xenophobia, and terrorism are clear threats to progress in this regard. Whether inflicted by states or non-state actors, these scourges require the united effort of the international community, which should be reminded of the inescapable truth that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. In conclusion, Rado calls upon all member states to abide by their respective responsibilities, as well as the collective responsibility before the Council, in upholding human rights, especially through the assistance of the OHCHR and its personnel on the ground, beginning with unhindered access. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Muchas gracias.
I thank you. I now give the floor to the International Federation for Human Rights Leagues. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, while at the end of 2015, 65 million people from war-torn countries or fleeing repressive regimes were reported to have left their country by the UNHCR, only about 1 million sought protection in Europe. Yet, months after months, thousands of people have been forced to take dangerous routes due to the lack of safe and legal channels for migration into Europe, many risking their lives at sea. Measures have been adopted across EU member states which make it increasingly difficult for asylum seekers and refugees to access international protection, and some of these states have built fences to prevent access to their territory. The EU Parliament is about to approve the replacement of Frontex with a border guards and coast guards body which will have more powers while still lacking a complaint mechanism. Meanwhile, a hostile rhetoric against migrants, asylum seekers and refugees has been promoted across Europe, which fuels xenophobic discourses and behaviors. It is high time for the Human Rights Council to unequivocally condemn Europe's shameful failure to adapt its migration and asylum policies to the influx of refugees, to show solidarity, to uphold the rule of law and to protect the rights of all people. We call on the EU and its member states to adopt a human rights-based approach to migration by prioritizing the protection of the rights of migrants, asylum seekers and refugees, taking urgent measures to prevent further loss of lives at sea, opening safe and legal migration channels, including by increasing resettlement capacities, and addressing the root causes of the violence that forces people to flee. We urge the EU to uphold the international asylum acquis they have contributed to build following 2 world wars. The unprecedented UN Summit for Refugees and Migrants of September 19 must be an opportunity to take concrete actions to protect the rights of refugees and migrant persons. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Article 19, International Centre Against Censorship. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, Article 19 agrees with the High Commissioner that when governments attempt to smash the voices of their people instead of serve them, the outcomes are disastrous. The situation in the Gambia is gravely concerning. The crackdown on independent and opposition voices continues unabated ahead of elections and deserves heightened scrutiny from this Council. States that fail to cooperate with OHCHR do not deserve the privilege of Human Rights Council membership. Reprisals against human rights defenders, such as Bahrain's use of travel bans to prevent travel to the HRC in June, are reprehensible. Article 19 is deeply concerned that in 41% of cases, states fail to respond to communications from the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, and that too many states are yet to respond to his requests for country visits or confirm those visits. We remain concerned that states are failing to implement the freedom of expression standards they commit to in this room. In June, states committed to protect the same rights that people have offline, online. That same month, Russia enacted the Yarayava package of laws, and Ethiopia enacted the Computer Cybercrime Proclamation, which threatened digital rights in both countries. In August, Ethiopia shut down the internet to restrict the coverage of protests in the country, despite commitments at Human Rights Council to refrain from such acts. In March, states committed to protect human rights in protest. We condemn the killings of 30 protesters and injury of many more at Bahir Dar in Ethiopia on 7th of August, and the killing of 8 people, including 1 journalist, during protests on 19th of June in Nochixtlan, Mexico. Media freedom is deteriorating worldwide against this Council's commitments on freedom of expression and on the safety of journalists. In Turkey, at least 115 journalists have been detained through the abuse of state of emergency powers, often in the absence of individualized evidence of involvement in a criminal act. In South Sudan, 3 media outlets have forcibly been closed since August, while several prominent journalists and editors have been subject to arbitrary arrest and detention since July and had their equipment confiscated. Entering its 2nd decade, the Human Rights Council must ensure that it is the torchbearer of the protection of human rights around the world, and states must fully implement the freedom of expression commitments they make in this room. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the Human Rights Information and Training Centre. You have the floor.
شكرا سيدي الرئيس. باسم مركز
Thank you, President. On behalf of the Information and Rehabilitation Centre, we would draw your attention to the situation of human rights in Yemen, and particularly that concerning women and children who are enduring clear, gross violations of their rights. Indeed, the number of children killed between September 2014 and March 2016 has been recorded at 647. 1,822 casualties have been recorded, 159 women have been killed, and 1,281 injuries. Recruitment of child soldiers by the Saleh militia inter alia is widespread. 72% of instances of documented recruitment are of minors who have been recruited by the Houthi and Saleh militia. We have also recorded instances of sexual abuse. Such recruits are forced to be posted at checkpoints. Unfortunately, the actions in recent years has led to an end to humanitarian support, and nothing has been done to combat this scourge of child recruitment. Despite the Security Council Resolution 2216, recently we've seen a proliferation of recruitment of women and girls into armed groups, with women and girls being utilized in the course of the incursions and attacks against demonstrators. Women and girls endure arbitrary detention, and the number of children arrested stands at 189. All of these rights violations affect in particular the Baha'i. 37 Baha'i women have been arrested. They were subsequently released, having committed to renouncing.
Asociación de Ciudadanos del Mundo.
You have the floor. Next speaker on the list, Association of World Citizens.
Association of World Citizens. You have the floor. Les cedo la palabra.
I now give the floor to the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. You have the floor.
Thank you. WILPF has been following the situation in Yemen with great concern. As the High Commissioner states in his report on Yemen to the session, the situation has deteriorated significantly in the past year. 80% of the population is in urgent need of humanitarian assistance, and more than 2.5 million people have been displaced. In such context, women and girls often suffer greatly and disproportionately due to forced displacement, sexual violence, and lack of access to sexual and reproductive health and victim and survivor assistance. Hospitals, schools, markets, and houses have been targeted by explosive weapons. The large destructive radius of such weapons means that even the striking of military targets within a populated area has caused the destruction or damaging of civilian infrastructure. Cluster munitions, which were banned in 2008 by a widely ratified treaty, have been used by the Saudi-led coalition. In one incident in March 2016, the coalition used US-supplied cluster munitions to attack a marketplace, killing at least 97 civilians, including 25 children. Mr. Vice President, WILPF urges the Saudi-led coalition to stop using cluster munitions, all parties to the conflict to stop using explosive weapons in populated areas, and all states to heed the call of the High Commission to, and I quote, refrain from encouraging or arming parties to the conflict, end of quote, and stop all arms transfers or license agreements with all warring parties. We also urge all states to condemn the targeting of civilian infrastructure by explosive weapons and to support the development of an international commitment to prevent such practices. Finally, Mr. President, we urge the international community to support interventions of disarmament, demobilization and reintegration of combatants, including child combatants, focus all efforts on finding a peaceful solution to the conflict, and ensure meaningful participation of Yemeni women in the peace process, as well as gender-sensitive humanitarian aid. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Muchas gracias.
I thank you. I now give the floor to the International Youth and Student Movement for the United Nations.
Tiene usted la palabra.
You have the floor.
No se encuentra en la sala.
The speaker is not in the room. I therefore give the floor to the Association for the Protection of Women and Children's Rights. You have the floor.
No se encuentra en la sala.
The speaker is not in the room. I give the floor to the International Service for Human Rights. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. There is a growing refrain in this Council calling for greater cooperation and dialogue, and certainly states should fully cooperate with the Office. There's a growing paradox, however, that many of the states loudest in this refrain are those very states identified by the High Commissioner as systematically failing to cooperate with the UN human rights mechanisms and is seeking to silence civil society at the national level and in some cases here itself. Like the High Commissioner, we are deeply concerned at the harassment, arbitrary arrest and detention of human rights defenders in Bahrain. This Council and those states in a position of influence on Bahrain must ensure that the country pays a real political and economic price for its systematic repression of civil society. Like the High Commissioner, we are also deeply concerned at the continued harassment of human rights defenders and family members in China. This September marks the 3rd anniversary of the enforced disappearance and arbitrary detention of Chinese human rights lawyer Chao Shun-li in connection with her engagement with the UPR. We reiterate our call for an independent and effective investigation into these violations and Chao Shun-li's subsequent death. Reprisals committed by member states of this Council deserve special condemnation. They are the antithesis of cooperation and dialogue. Burundi's failure to engage with the Committee Against Torture and its threat of reprisals against civil society actors who sought to cooperate with that body to end gross and systematic violations in the country should be denounced. It is high time that the Council enforced basic membership standards and recommended suspension of those who fail them. The worsening incidents of reprisals, from Bahrain to Venezuela, are evidence that the UN Secretariat, this Council and states are failing to protect those who risk their lives to defend the universal rights to which we are all purportedly pledged. This must not be the legacy left by the Secretary-General, the High Commissioner or Member States, and we reiterate our call for a comprehensive, effective, high-level response without delay. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
I thank you. I give the floor for a joint statement to Save the Children International. You have the floor.
Mr. Chair, we welcome the participation of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in the UN Summit for Refugees and Migrants next week. This summit represents a historic opportunity to address one of the greatest challenges of our age, to protect and assist millions of refugees and migrants in search of safety and dignity. Millions of people have been forced from their homes by conflict, persecution or human rights violations, but also for other reasons, including lack of livelihood, food insecurity or environmental disasters. Many are vulnerable while moving, drowning at sea, dying or being brutalized and exploited. Children are at the center of these movements, with nearly 50 million children moving within or across borders. They may be refugees, internally displaced or migrants. They are children first and foremost, and irrespective of their status, they have rights. Every day, children on the move are detained simply because of their migration status, and despite compelling evidence that detention can have permanent negative effects on children's physical and mental health, even for short-term periods. As displacement becomes increasingly protected, migrant children are finding themselves stranded for years in distress. Without adequate protection and support services, these children are exposed to further risk of violence, trafficking and exploitation. We call on Member States to comply with their human rights obligations, including to observe the rights of children on the move in their best interest in all migration policies and procedures, and end the practice of detaining children on the basis of migration status. Alternatives to detention must always be found for children and their families. Ensure access to essential services for all children on the move, including access to education within 1 month. And to establish mechanisms of responsibility sharing based on human rights principles, including an effective resettlement system. Safe and regular channels should be ensured, including more flexible family reunification processes, humanitarian visa, private sponsorship program and student scholarship schemes. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to France Liberté, Fondation Daniel Mitterrand. You have the floor.
No se encuentra en la sala.
The speaker is not in the room.
Para el
I give the floor to the International Council for Support to Fair Trials and Human Rights.
No está en
The speaker is not.
International Humanist and Ethical Union.
International Humanist and Ethical Union. You have the floor. Thank you, President. Distinguished High Commissioner, we share the concerns that you have voiced with regard to violations of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran and deeply regret the lack of cooperation on the part of the Iranian authorities with your office and more generally the denial of access to the international community. executions following legal rulings or extrajudicial executions are commonplace. De facto, executions on the basis of their opinion or religious beliefs do not date only from 2016, since as of 1988, some 30,000 political prisoners, members of the People's Mujahideen organization, have been executed following a fatwa from Ayatollah Khomeini. An audio recording published on the 9th of August this year contains Ayatollah Montazeri's voice. He was to replace Khomeini at the head of the Iranian state. Montazeri was speaking to the perpetrators of this massacre, who continue to occupy high-ranking posts in the power structure, including in the judiciary. He stated that the worst of crimes of the history of the Islamic Republic of Iran are being committed at their hands, and that executing thousands of persons could ultimately be counterproductive, end quote. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, FIDH and numerous international legal professionals have already described this massacre as a crime against humanity. High Commissioner, you stated states may shut the office out, but they will not shut us up, neither will they blind us. Thousands of families to this day do not know where their relatives who were victims of the massacre were buried. They were thrown into mass graves around the capital and major cities. We therefore call upon the Human Rights Council mechanisms to open an inquiry into this flagrant and gross human rights violation in Iran. I thank you.
Muchas gracias. Le cedo la...
Thank you. I now give the floor to the International Council for Support for Fair Trial and Human Rights. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We proudly commend the High Commissioner's report regarding Bahrain as well as Yemen, and his statement in a prior time stating that Saudi-led coalition raids targeted schools, hospitals, markets and weddings, infrastructure, public and private, and imposed restrictions and a siege which exacerbate the humanitarian crisis. We have documented raids using cluster bombs that killed 4,000 people and injured 7,000 others. All of these are egregious violations of international human rights and international law in context of conflicts. 18 months on from this barbarian aggression in light of international silence, Mr. President, we have to note that legal commitment means ensuring accountability for the perpetrators of these crimes, including states and individuals. So Yemen, with your support, has the right to pursue Saudi Arabia as a country and other criminal of wars, especially that you have received days ago the London documents and reports by the Yemeni people. And in our organization, we underline the demands. First, UN member states, in line with the UN Charter and also Article 103 of the ICCPR, these should respect the sovereignty and will of the Yemeni population, which is reflected in its parliament and its rallies in last August. Also, immediate stopping of the use of force against the independence and will of the people of Yemen. Third, the international community, in line with Geneva Conventions 1949, should pursue all criminals and set up an international independent inquiry committee to investigate war crimes and crimes against humanity committed within the context of this barbaric aggression against Yemen. Thank you.
I thank you. I now give the floor to the International Humanist and Ethical Union. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, we thank the OHCHR for its report on the panel on preventing and countering violent extremism. We still share the concerns articulated by many CSOs at the time of the panel regarding the lack of agreed definitions and room for human rights abuse when it comes to prevention. As an organisation specifically tasked with promoting human rights within the secular context, the IHEU is also deeply concerned at the way in which some states have been dealing with extremism by instrumentalising and distorting the concept of secularism in order to undermine the rights to freedom of expression and freedom of religion or belief. In some Central Asian states, particularly Tajikistan, we have seen how the notion of secularism has been mixed with measures seeking to combat extremism, leading to crackdowns on wearing Islamic dress, sporting beards, practicing religious rituals in public spaces, and imposed compulsory religious censorship. The banning of the burkini by local authorities across France is another stark example of a harmful conflation of anti-extremism and secularism and based on double standards. Language used by the French authorities included provocation, offence and public morals, is a mirror image of the type of rhetoric we have highlighted at the Council before, being used by governments in many Islamic states as justification for enforcing conservative dress codes. Properly understood, political and legal secularism is the best potential framework in which to provide the conditions for the flourishment of human rights, since it insists all people are seen as equal agents, regardless of their beliefs. Disproportionately limiting the right to freedom of expression through bans on clothing or facial hair, particularly when targeted at one minority, debases the concept of secularism. We again ask that the OHCHR explores the role of secularism in the protection of human rights, particularly with a view to preventing this harmful instrumentalization of secularism, specifically in the context of combating violent extremism. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the Centre for Human Rights and Peace Advocacy.
Mr. President, my organization would like to commend the High Commissioner for the thought-provoking updates to the Council. We share High Commissioner's finding on the growing refusal by an increasing number of member states to grant the Human Rights Commission on the human rights mechanisms and access to their countries. I would like to refer the High Commissioner's public request to the governments of India and the Islamic Republic of Pakistan for unhindered access to disputed territory. My organization welcomes the statement of the High Commissioner. The government of Pakistan's willingness to give access to the United Nations fact-finding mission is appreciable. To inform the Council, Indian administration has plans to blind generations of the occupied Kashmir, similar to those exercised in the genocide of Sikhs in 1984. For the last 66 days, the Indian side of Kashmir, Punjab and other states are under siege, or likewise. Indian armed forces use bullets to kill and pellets to blind innocents who demand their rights or the self-determination. Torture, arbitrary detention, harassments are the order of the day. Medical and essentials items are virtually non-existent or are in crisis stage. Mr. President, it is urged to the Council to impress upon the Indian administration to end the repression, listen to reasons, repel the Armed Forces Special Powers Act immediately, and bring perpetrators of human rights to justice. I thank you, sir.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Indigenous People of Africa Coordinating Committee. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, our organization welcomed the oral updates by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, where he mentioned about alarming human rights abuse and violation across the globe. However, we are surprised to observe that there was no single reference to human rights abuse in armed conflict areas in India, especially northeast states of India. Under the armed rules, Armed Forces Special Power Act 1958 is imposed only in northeast region and Jammu Kashmir. It creates extrajudicial execution, arbitrary detentions, rape, torture and the forced disappearance of thousands of youths and the indigenous population. In a nutshell, information of forced disappearance in Manipur, Government of India's army have been occupied Tombisna High School for their base that was shifted last year. When they left the school, the government of Manipur started digging the place to make a new construction. During that process, many head skulls were found out. The discovery that has led to more worries for the families of those in Manipur whose relatives disappeared in the last 3 decades and so their bodies never found. So long, these families have alleged that those who disappeared were actually killed in counterinsurgency or operation in the state. Most of them packed encounters and the bodies were dumped away. Last month in the states of Tripura, after the by-election results, more than 500 indigenous Tripolis were beaten by the Bengali goons. Hundreds of them left their home and ran away to save their lives. However, government of India neither intervenes to resolve the conflict nor took any protection actions to make peace seriously. The government has failed in its duty to protect the tribal population in Agartala. Our organization requests with this council for repeal APASPA from India. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the International Muslim Women's Union. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we International Muslim Women Union appreciate and welcome the statement of UN Human Rights Commissioner on the grave human rights situation of Jammu and Kashmir. We also appreciate his concern and for unconditional access to both sides of line of control. Mr. President, we are not telling stories here, but the fact is that from last 2 months, India has created history in Jammu and Kashmir by blinding small children, young men and women, using pellet guns in millions to suppress the people of Jammu and Kashmir, by stopping access to all communication tools, internet and telephone services, by creating atmosphere of fear and uncertainty among people, by blinding them for life, by creating medical, human emergency, stopping ambulances to lost blood, not to get medical treatment, not to shift to other medical clinics and hospitals. People are crying for help, but due to continued 65 days curfew, they want to break down their will to demand basic right to self-determination. Unattended them in hospitals because staff is not allowed to go and join their people, by keeping them out of medical treatment so they cannot lose hope not to see. Mr. President, pellet guns, burst of tear smoke shells have injured 11,000 and blinded more than 190 were killed. We do not know what to do, what to say and what to tell. My people are being pushed to death, slow death. There is suffocation and enforced use of weapons and raids, and people are forced to vacate their homes. In these circumstances, the statement of UN High Commissioner for Human Rights is a hope of life for my people, and welcome him to send immediate envoy to investigate.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Zudwind. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Sudwind appreciates the updated statement of the High Commissioner, which has had a broad and positive reaction between Iranian civil society actors. Although an invitation has been extended by the Islamic Republic of Iran since February 1998 to the High Commissioner of Human Rights, the country has in the last 18 years failed to provide the necessary preconditions for such a visit to take place. It is the High Commissioner's office prerogative to have effective and unfettered access to the country, including its prisons, meeting victims of human rights violations and independent civil society activists. Nevertheless, these minimum conditions are yet to be accepted by the Islamic Republic of Iran. During the past 11 years, no thematic special rapporteur has been granted visa to visit Iran. The refusal of cooperation by the Islamic Republic of Iran is not only limited to the High Commissioner's office and the special procedures including the country mandate, but is also extended to other human rights bodies. Accepted recommendations of the first UPR cycle remained without actions, and there is no sign of any actions regarding accepted recommendations of the second UPR cycle. Despite the Islamic Republic of Iran's voluntary pledges to consider the accessions of CEDAW, the Convention Against Torture, and reconsidering the general reservation on the HRC in May 2006, the country is now refusing to comply with recommendations regarding the ratification of CEDAW, CAT, and the withdrawal of the reservation on CRC. Mr. Vice President, Sudwind believes that in contrary to the claim made by countries that violate human rights, the shaming does not come by naming, but by these countries' repeated grave, widespread and systematic practice of human rights violations. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the Latin American Foundation for Human Rights and Social Development. You have the floor. Distinguished Council members, with regard to Report 33/20 on the abolition of the death penalty, we note with concern that this measure continues to be applied in certain countries of the Americas, such as the United States. We are concerned that this practice continues, and according to the 2015 figures, 1,500 executions were carried out and 3,000 pending. According to paragraph 18 of the report, we learn that the state of North Carolina has adopted a law to re-establish the death penalty. We highlight that detainees remain in the Guantanamo Bay military facility in Cuba. They are arbitrarily denied their liberty. The High Commissioner has clearly called for the closure of this torture center. We acknowledge the efforts by the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela with regard to prison reforms in the country, bearing in mind the recommendations of the 2011 UPR, whereby it has reformed and redesigned prison facilities to improve conditions for inmates, in addition to the implementation of social and educational measures and extensive support for families of detainees, as well as human rights training for prison officials and detainees. Venezuela recently adopted the National Human Rights Plan in compliance with the resolution of the World Human Rights Conference of 1993 held in Vienna. As a Venezuelan, as a human rights defender working for an NGO to support the poor and foster dignity, we have for the last 40 years been deeply concerned at the absence of action on part of the OHCHR, and we are concerned at the distorted view of the Venezuelan situation conveyed by certain NGOs and the media portrayal of the country. We call upon the Council to bear in mind the progressive human rights progress achieved by Venezuela over the last 17 years. I thank you. The Vice President, thank you. I now give the floor to the Non-Violent Radical Party. You have the floor.
Mr. President, dear participants, my name is Abdurrahman Mahdi and I am taking the floor on behalf of the Non-Violent Radical Party, Transnational Transparty. While in Ethiopia, in theory, has a federal constitution that guarantees wide-ranging autonomy for the nation, based federal states and equal participation in national politics, in practice almost all the nations have no real say in political, economic and military affairs. Instead, these fall under the sole control of a Tigray-dominated elite who does not shy away from using excessive force and violence as events over the past years clearly bear witness of, with protests most notably in Oromia and Amhara being met by violent repression by the authorities. Approximately 500 people have died since November, and this is only the latest evidence of the readiness of the government to accept brute force against civilians. In some regions, rape has become a primary weapon used by the Ethiopian army and paramilitary forces to instill fear and total control. This information seldom reaches the international audience due to the criminalization of free speech in Ethiopia. Instead, activists, journalists and opposition politicians end up in jail, especially the Ogaden region, which is de facto off limits for international observers, where even impartial humanitarian organizations such as the ICRC are not allowed to operate. We would like to thank the United Nations for recognizing the gravity of the situation in Ethiopia and for requesting an international investigation. However, based on past experience, we also acknowledge that the counter-proposal put forth by the Ethiopian government to conduct an internal investigation will not bring closure to the culture of impunity in Ethiopia. Previous internal investigations by the government in Sidama and Ogaden were never fair, and the violations still continue. In light of the above, and in order to restore peace and security in the spirit of the United Nations, we would like to ask the United Nations Human Rights Council to establish a commission of inquiry with full mandate into all alleged human rights violations in Ethiopia. Thank you.
I thank you. I now give the floor to Presse Emblème Campagne. You have the floor.
No se encuentra en la sala.
The speaker is not in the room. I now give the floor to the All China Environment Federation. You have the floor.
Thank you. Dear Vice President, right to development is important human rights, and environmental CSO plays an important role in promoting and safeguarding the development rights of the general public. The All China Environment Federation, established in 2005, is a nationwide non-profit CSO in the field of environment. Its objective is to promote the sustainable strategy and provide the environmental rights of the general public. And ACF provides legal service to the pollution victims promoted the environmental rights legislation and also promoted the environmental technology innovation based on the enterprises' demand. In partnership with the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, ACF successfully applied and implemented a project of United Nations Democracy Fund aiming to encourage the public participation in environmental protection through awareness raising, training for public interest lawyers, and provision of legal aid to victims of pollution, as well as policy recommendation for the improvement of environmental legislation. The project gained the recognition from our government, and the UN Deputy Secretary General Jim Ellison highly praised the ACF for the environmental work. ACF looks forward to continuing its cooperation with other UN agencies, government, and all stakeholders to contribute to the sustainable development in China and large. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Auspice Stella. You have the floor. Vice President, we welcome the annual report of the High Commissioner, particularly the reference to promotion of the right to development. As ILO Convention 169 states, indigenous people should have the right to take decisions on their own priorities on development. But all too often this has been ignored by the Chilean authorities. One cannot talk about development where there is a negative effect on the environment and belief systems and social systems of the Mapuche people. Many of these problems derive from a lack of political will to curb the capitalist urges of enterprises which are laying waste to forests, land, water and the environment. The historic land conflict in Mapuche territory has led to a water conflict following the establishment of dozens of hydroelectric projects. For example, holding RP Global Chile, which built a hydro plant in Trangil in Panguipulli commune, where a mini power plant was established without consultation, thereby violating cultural and spiritually important places. Conflict as a result of the imposition of electrical lines arose because families had not authorized the establishment of these power plants. This included the death of Macarena Valdez, the wife of Ruben Coelho, the spokesperson for the opponents of the electrical cable project. Mr. Coelho was opposed to the laying of cables, but was expelled by members of the law enforcement and seriously injured by workers of the power company. His wife was found dead in odd circumstances. We call for rapid investigation of this case and continue to stress that conflicts of this kind will continue if there is no genuine desire to apply laws and international commitments entered into by Chile, which they are systematically failing to comply with. I thank you. The Vice President, thank you. I now give the floor to the Arab Commission for Human Rights.
Mr. Vice President. Mr. High Commissioner, as you stated, Israel has had a long record of refusing to cooperate with the United Nations. Over the past months, Israel has continued its colonial enterprise by expanding settlements and continued to kill Palestinian civilians with impunity. In this context, we are extremely concerned about the increasing waves of reprisals against Palestinian human rights defenders, such as Issa Amru, the chair of Youth Against Settlements in Hebron. Over the past years, he has been systematically arrested, beaten, and received death threats from Israeli forces and settlers. He is now facing a trial with charges being dragged up over 6 years that places him under imminent risk of imprisonment. Issa Amru has been in Geneva several times to address this concern. His case demands your immediate attention, and we urge you to call on the Israeli authorities to clear him from trumped up charges and guarantee his full protection and safety. Mr. High Commissioner, as you rightly state, human rights violence will not disappear with unwanted publicity is silence. We call you to pay particular attention to the situation in the OPT and include the country in your next update. Finally, we would like to ask you to restore the lost resources for work against racism at your office and not continue to be silent on the commemoration of the Great Durban Declaration and Program of Action. If even the High Commissioner for Human Rights gives into the defamation campaign against the Security Council's adopted document, it sends a devastating message to all the victims of racism. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. This concludes the general debate on the oral update by the High Commissioner.